Welcome back. You're watching the Front Row. Kenyans from all walks of life are feeling the pinch as both electricity and fuel prices register significant increases, causing ripple effects in transport, manufacturing and other businesses. Our reporter Kevin Ogutu gives us the Mwananchi perspective, since it is evident that the prices will not be coming down anytime soon.
It is no doubt a difficult time to be a Kenyan. For millions of Kenyans, the increase in petroleum fuel announced last week and electricity bills as well mean more than just the figures.
From here to Kisii, where we now get our stock, the fare has now doubled. For example, some few weeks ago, from here to Kisii, it was 400. As we speak, they charge 600, excluding what we call the luggage fee.
Kenyans are desperate, and increase in fuel affects every field and transport and such kind of a thing. And due to the effect of corona, you see people are crying. People are not able.
Unapata wameongeza fuel na msara hawajaongeza. Sasa unapata hiyo inatuumiza sana. Juu wakiongeza kila kitu bei yake inaenda juu. Lakini msara is remain the same. Hapo ndio tunalilia sana. Kwa kibarua, ukienda kwa kibarua kama ulikuwa unalipa 1,000, it's still 1,000 that they pay you, but the fuel has gone up. So it's a bit challenging.
According to data by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, the amount of thermal power consumed by Kenyans over the first half of this year increased to 503 million units, a 58% growth from 307 million units used over a similar period in 2020. And now, the high fuel and electricity prices are rekindling debate on taxing energy in the country. The government takes 43.65%, that is 58.1 shillings of the super petrol retail price. This at a time curfew is still in place, meaning shrunk production hours.
And this COVID, you know how the police is also chasing us up and down, anything small, you have to pay for it. It is so taxing. Curfew hours still remains the same, and the increase of fuel also has affected us so much.
It is no different for electricity, where out of the 25 shillings that a domestic consumer will pay for a unit of electricity in September, about 9.2 shillings or 36.8% will go towards taxes and levies. Kevin Ogutu, KTN News.
A lot of issues there raised by Kenyans, COVID-19, everything going up, but money in the pocket. That's the only thing that's not increasing. But let me just pick it up from where we left it off. The debt burden and the struggle to repay these particular debts. Do you think this is the major driver of what we're experiencing now, or the other parameters?
There are definitely other parameters, but let's start from the debt conversation. Kenya is owing about 7.7 trillion shillings. We are a GDP of about 10.5 trillion shillings. That makes our debt burden to be at 71%. And so that's all the money we owe the Chinese, the Swedish, the Americans, if any, and the multilateral organizations. But that is also a component of the local or domestic debt. Now, on top of that, we are of every money that we collect, I saw the controller of budget complaining the other day that about 60% or 66% of every money we collect goes towards debt repayment. That means, therefore, that the government only has 40% or 34% to work with in terms of providing basic services like education, health, and otherwise. In principle, whether they like it or not, they have to either borrow or get a grant or sell parastatals.
For sustenance. For
sustenance, or to be able to offer the services that they are supposed to offer. Right now, the sale of parastatals is not as lucrative as it used to be, and it's not as fast a process that, you know, in those days, the president could just declare a pipeline is gone and it is gone. And so then their options are very limited, so to speak, and they are forced now to borrow and repay. And this is why then government is very focused on collecting revenue. We will make all the noise, but ultimately they have to collect revenue. And they will collect it from something that they are sure you and I will use, whether we like it or not. And that is something like fuel. There will be VAT on fuel. There will be levies on fuel, because they have found themselves in a conundrum that they cannot come out of. Are there other factors to the cost of living, and on the other hand, the high costs of energy?
Right.
So definitely there are. The international fuel prices have been unstable. But if you look at the international fuel prices earlier in the year, you know, towards now, they had gone down significantly. Ours was still either level or even going upwards, which is very surprising, because then you'd expect that we are corresponding to the international fuel prices. The other thing also that I think is actually a reality in our case is governance and corruption. There is too much corruption that is going, because you see, yes, we are collecting how much? 1.5 trillion. Yeah. But we actually have capacity to collect up to even 3 trillion or more. But a lot of it is lost somewhere out of waste and misgovernance.
And of course, that public wage bill is another conversation altogether. Let me bring you in right now, because Odhiambo here says they have no choice. They will keep coming back to what we use every day. Fuel, look at VAT. We are talking about the digital service tax. I think LPG. They will look for the basic things we use at home. So then what options would be there in terms of taxation? You've mentioned one, but how can they wiggle themselves out of this without overburdening an already overtaxed group? Conversations around opening up or expanding the tax bracket.
A few suggestions. So apart from debt, I think is inefficiency. So one is, you've pointed out, looking at our wage bill. So there have been reports from the Salaries and Remuneration Commission, very excellent recommendations that we need to address a key aspect being allowances. Because you look at the rates we pay in allowances, looking at the control of budget report and the SRC report itself, and that is a key area that has been isolated. Of course, there isn't political will to address it. So that means citizens themselves, being the people that bear the burden of that tax, needs to add their voice or see how to mobilize and push against this. So on that aspect, I would also push that the independent committees looking at the control of budget, SRC, they need to add their voice, and particularly the control of budget has a capacity to not release funds to any public entity, that there's a lot of efficiency around. If you also look at the control of budget reports, there's a lot of wastage there. So I feel that we first must scrutinize what is this expenditure that we say government has a lot that it's paying. There are areas that can and must be reduced. Right. Secondly, when you're looking at taxation, even if the government, I've had Odhiambo mentioning that we do have capacity to collect the 3 trillion. I hope government looks at that in the sense of sealing the corrupt loopholes, but what I feel it would be, they will look at other products that are used more by citizens and tax that. So there's lack of creativity from government, and even if we say we want to tax citizens, I'm also seeing citizens finding ways of evading and avoiding that taxation. So that is also something that government must be alive to. So the targets that government sets in its documents and says these are our revenue targets, they might not get those targets simply because we as the taxpayers will also find a way of going around it. So lastly also, is, as I'd mentioned, is to look at other creative ways of funding these budgets and funding a modest budget. Of course, we have seen institutions coming, recent regulations from the control of budget that also gives her room much more capacity to scrutinize some of these debt agreements, because we are saying we have debt, but have we looked at those agreements and have we negotiated well? We've had opportunity to look at the reports by Honorable Wandai. The Parliamentary Accounts Committee has also given really good recommendations in as far as the debt conversation and the issues around debt, and has also given a roadmap that this ought to have been addressed within 3 months. So if our government really wants the support of taxpayers for us to pay, then they also must demonstrate that they are taking steps to address those key recommendations, because I think they are good recommendations that can kind of get us off the issues we find ourselves
if
in.
considered
Yes,
and implemented.
But we're not very hopeful that will be done. Yeah.
You're not very hopeful. What?
We have seen the trend, because if you are saying, okay, first, the moment you're coming to raise taxes in the sense of the finance bill or act being passed, I would expect that Honorable Gladys Wanga would first say, show me steps that you have taken in addressing the recommendations by my colleague at the park level. So then you do not have capacity as a committee member or a honorable member to then burden taxpayers when you haven't made use of a report that your own colleagues have taken time to look at. We have seen, if you look at the summary from OPO's committee, saying within the COVID period they've managed to do 100 sittings, and that is something that is really commendable. His committee has been able to look at the reports from the Auditor General and moved it. There was quite a backlog of the same. So they have pushed. So it is also an opportunity, because then if you oversee a process that says tax include minimum taxation, includes digital services taxation, tax, without then asking if I bring in more tax, because yes, they can think of very many revenue-raising measures. But that will not add to our revenue unless we also address those key wastage. So I feel we are continuing to burden taxpayers, but we are not addressing the key aspects. So I would say that the Wanga-led committee missed a critical opportunity to make sure that the recommendations from their sister committee are addressed. And that's why I think we are also not having a lot of the linkages between the different public entities that are charged with oversight.
Would you say it's time to go back to the drawing board then? and unfortunately, I'm asking that with a government that's on its way out.
No, it's not an unfortunate conversation to have. Well, first of all, let me say that, no, I'm not agreeable to, passing the buck to the public, as she was saying. I think the government needs to take responsibility. And now just bringing in the public and saying that the public needs to do more in terms of activism. Come on, we've done enough activism. We've gone to court. We've made noise. But no one is listening. And I think then it's just time that government took responsibility. And where they fail to take responsibility, then, of course, the vote is coming next year, as you put it. But now let's go to what you're proposing, going back to the drawing board.
Is there anything like that? Maybe let's start from there.
There's no reset button in the economic equation. What the controller of budget was proposing is workable. One, we need to restructure the debt that we have and just make it somewhat manageable, because where we are is unsustainable. We are well beyond the World Bank and IMF recommendation of 60%, 71%. They tried to manage that by rebasing. Rebasing only gave them half a billion, to work with. So we are not at a good place. So that restructuring is important. But the second thing is, I think we need to manage our wage bill and just overall our costs. There is too much deficit that needs debt financing. And as we progress, you see Parliament coming up with legislative budgeting, that this needs to be in the budget, whether you like it or you don't. But there is no money. They are not looking at the revenue side to then tell you that how are you going to get money for this. And so for me, we need to lower the costs of business and government. And by that, we need to lower the wage bill. We need to lower the deficits, and that will manage the debt significantly. And finally, in terms of now the fuel question, really, come on, the levels that we've gone to are just too much. The recommendation that we have is from the IMF and the World Bank. We are back to what you call the drawing board, which is the structural adjustment programs. So that now, as some of my colleagues say, we are reporting to New York. The Minister of Finance is reporting to New York. So that New York says increase the taxes, we increase the taxes without looking at the reality on the ground. And I think that's not workable. We need to really look into the situation and manage it from the inside.
There's an interesting question here from one of our viewers, and she's saying, greetings, 2 questions for the panelists. One, what in his view, does the next government have to do in order to stabilize the economy without overburdening the citizens with heavy taxation? And two, what is the role of citizens in budget making, and to what extent? I think you can take that. Mm-hmm. Maybe we start with the first question that he's called Avoso K. Is there anything like stabilizing the economy without overburdening the citizens with heavy taxation? Is it possible?
It is. Let me just give a background. You see, the challenge we've had with this administration, God forbid that I have to say this one more time, is their focus on the brick and mortar investment. So that then we have good roads, we thank God, we have the SGR. But then now you ask yourself, what is the return on investment? And you're told, chill out, in 20 years,
time.
Yes, you'll probably have return on investment. But you see, we are paying for the benefits that will be accrued in 20 years today, which means then that we are paying for a generation to come without necessarily seeing the benefits now. Yet there are other options that we could have used that would have paid themselves, so to speak. So there is need for us to look back and say, can we focus on human development projects, so to speak? And this is what the Big Four agenda was supposed to achieve: create employment. And you create employment through manufacturing, especially in the urban centers, and agriculture and some natural resources in the rural areas. And that was the food security angle. So that then you create employment, you ensure there is food security, you lower inflation, you ensure that your shilling is now stronger, because then you are able to export. So to speak, then people don't struggle the way they are. So that then what you have is just to lower your wage bill, and you can actually survive without debt. If you have to get debt, then you can now access the lower costing debts that are available with the multilateral organizations, as opposed to these expensive commercial debts that we are going for. And I know that we are going for them because our rating has gone down, and it has gone down because of what we've done. So it's a very bad cycle we have put ourselves in. If the next government can focus on human development indices, like employment, like food security, as opposed to brick and mortar development, I think we can go further. And I think Avoso's question will be answered in that we will be able to stabilize the economy without borrowing.
It's doable.
It is doable.
Your thoughts? I think I'll really need to comment on that as well. Let's hear your thoughts.
I've had a lot of what he said, but I think it will take time. We're talking about the incoming government. So I think the onslaught on the economy so far, it has taken a really good beating, so to speak. So I don't think it would be able to bounce back immediately, because some of these debts are debts that, as we know, are kind of generational. So that's one thing that will take time. The public services have also been neglected for a long time. As is mentioned, the focus has been, let us have the roads. But have you looked at our healthcare, looked at the schools, the funding that we are giving to schools in terms of capitation per child? So that will take quite some time to address. And that's why then, as a country, I think we need to focus on institutions and strengthening institutions rather than the politicians who, as we've agreed, come and go. So the issues of the legacy projects and what we are trying to push, that the president is, his term is coming to an end, and so there are some projects that we must pass, but these are burdens that will carry for long, and a burden that will be hanging on the next administration. So you will find that the next administration will have to answer to key concerns or try to address things whose root causes went far. So to address the question, I think that on the role of citizens in the budget process, that's a critical one.
Extent,
that's a critical one, and I think that is where we've missed. If you look at, in terms of legislation, it's very robust and provides and places quite a lot of premium on public participation by the citizens. But you'd find that this is particularly undertaken by citizens who would not have the critical technical input like what Mr. Odhiambo is telling us. So the Odhiambos, the middle class, would be trying to work around their daily living. So you leave this with some of the citizens that cannot engage key budget documents. So first, how do we build capacity of these citizens to engage and look at these documents is one issue. So I feel that we can address it from two angles. So citizens then need to look at the budget from the formulation stage, because that is where the budgeted corruption that we speak about comes in. So priorities such as what we are hearing, the send-off package for governors and the likes, that really shouldn't be something that features in the priorities of right now when we're looking at debt and issues like that. So if citizens would be very keen at looking at what goes and what projects we want to fund within the budget. Secondly, also to follow the implementation, because it's one thing to have the project within the budget, but at the implementation stage, we don't know how that works out. So if we could also have our eye and point out before we let the Auditor General come to look at the tail end. And of course, towards the audit part of the budget process, where then key institutions like the Auditor General have given their reports, but as citizens querying this, and now that we are saying we are going to the electioneering period, are we using some of those documents to say, hey, how did this politician use the resources we entrusted, and would we want to entrust them? So I'm looking at citizens being very, very vibrant, and now is an opportunity to test, as we are going into the election, the critical role of citizens in the budget process.
You've talked about something that is not making people very happy, lowering the wage bill, and someone is saying, how do you lower wage bill when the cost of living is skyrocketing? Workers will soon go to the streets and demand for more money.
Before the wage bill, let me just say...
It's a tough balancing act.
It is. But, you know, the whole... let me not come to that first. Let me start with something that she mentioned that I wanted to say is, yes, I agree, it will not, the turnaround will not be immediate. In December 2002, Emilio Moi Kibaki came to power, when Moi had been in power forever. And we were... You know, the economy was contracting at levels of around 0.3%, even higher. In about 2 years, the economy had turned around. We had received significant investment. There was a lot of participation from the international community in our local economy. I am still hopeful that we can find ourselves in 2002 again with a new regime, with significant investment, foreign direct investment coming into the country. This is doable. Granted, we are at a different situation in terms of the global recovery from COVID, but it is still doable. Now, as regards reducing the wage bill, yes. You see, the challenge we have with a large wage bill is that you would keep 20,000 in employment. And when you keep 20,000 in employment, they are receiving salaries. God bless them. But now the challenge is for you to ensure that you pay them and they're actually in employment. You're going to cost the whole country some health services that they could have received, or some education that they could have received, or you're going to have to increase taxes on fuel and ensure that everybody is complaining about high cost of living. Is there a way in which we can then reduce the wage bill and ensure that even though these 20,000 people are no longer in employment, but then they can access opportunities elsewhere with a golden handshake, and then the rest of the country can actually have a reprieve so that then the cost of living is managed. And this is, yes, it's a tight balancing act that a fresh government can do within the few days. Because you see, a fresh government has this, there's still excitement about it. You know, they are still enjoying the honeymoon stage. So they can afford to make some difficult choices, as opposed to an old government that's going out. And I think that is why it will be possible for the next government to do it very easily.
Okay, let's take a look at something else here. Charles Rubia says that he blames Parliament. They pass everything brought to them by the executive. No member of Parliament should be re-elected again. That's Charles Rubia on Twitter. And George Thevirus, I hope I got it right, says, tax levy laws. Someone else says, this is the worst Parliament in Kenya's history. Someone else here says, Karaoke Moire says, the government of Kenya can reduce the burden of high petrol prices by reducing pump tax by 50%. Taxes are around 60 shillings per litre. That would adjust price of unleaded to 100 shillings per litre. Diesel would cost even less. then fill the revenue gap by devolving KRA tax stations. It'll be interesting to hear what our panelists will have to say about that. And then we also have, Avoso still says, the citizens have a say in the budget-making process through public participation. And how effective or heavy is their voice? Do they have power to sanction budget lines as proposed by the executive? And Irene here has really talked about that extensively. Tomken Baraza saying, Front Row, Parliament is to blame for approving the tax of fuel. How comes fuel in Uganda and Tanzania is cheaper than in Kenya? The main function of the government is to provide security to its citizens. Kenyans are really, really suffering. And quite a number of thoughts here. We'll be looking at the text lines when we get back. We've talked about, where do we go from here, if there's a possibility of making any changes. But then we're having this conversation right in the middle of a pandemic, a global phenomenon that has affected a lot of countries. The conversation now is on vaccination. Kenya is at, I think, 3%, 3% right now. The fact that we are dealing with public debt issues and the straining bit of repayment, we are dealing with the effects of COVID-19, massive effects from 2020 especially, but there's still containment measures that have been put in place to protect Kenyans. Some would argue it is time to open up the economy so that we can go out and look for this money. Your thoughts on that?
It's a delicate balancing act, looking at health, because then if the health of our people is not guaranteed and we are not comfortable, you might go and say, yes, we want to run the economy, but it will still grind to a standstill, yeah, if people are not, if health is not prioritized. So I think on that specific one, the urge, I would say, to rush and the impatience that also our people are exhibiting is because people do not have money. So as we've said, our bad habits in terms of how we execute our budget has also reduced the capacity of the government to provide a safety net for its people. Remember the lowering of the corporate taxation, the income tax was for a very short time. And if you see the rationale of government vacating that again was that we have lost so much revenue. So it was interesting for us, the question being, we always lose so much revenue in terms of corruption, but there isn't so, as in it isn't addressed as fast. But when government saying we are losing revenue, so the solution is let us continue back to the tax rate, I think that is also the reason then that government has not really been able to cushion its people, and hence the people are pushing for the economy to be open. But
because some say, I will die of hunger.
Yes, and which is true.
So I would rather die of hunger than...
So it's a caution, I guess, that if push comes to shove, and indeed it has already, looking at the cry from the public, is that government needs to see how then do we, without fully opening the economy because of the health concerns, how do you continue providing a safety net to the people? But we then again need to provide safety nets looking at the nature of our economy. Remember, a lot of the safety nets were given simply because if you give the income tax, you're imagining most Kenyans are formally employed, but our economy is quite the opposite. So who benefits from that? So even as we push then government, that if the health protocol still evidence that we must continue and tread carefully, then let us then revert and provide some safety nets, but provide that safety net looking and being alive to the nature of the economy that we have that is not fully formal, but a lot of us are in the informal sector. I think that is what I would say on that.
Okay. To reopen or not, Mr. Odhiambo?
That's usually tricky conversation for me. Let me start perhaps by just commenting on the fiscal measures that His Excellency the President announced last year, and that the Minister of Finance, repeated in the reading of budget last year. As economists, we are usually uncomfortable with fiscal measures to create, a cushion for the public. And the reason is this. When you reduce, for example, the pay, and you say, these guys are going to get a reduction, the people who benefit and the people who don't, and the people who actually need to benefit, worlds apart. The second thing also that you need to look at is in terms of the corporate tax, yes, they were given the reprieve to keep people in employment. But you see, corporates still let people go. And so the challenge of fiscal measures of that caliber is that the people who actually, in fact, benefit from them are the people who actually should pay more taxes at a time like that. The people with the resources get to benefit more from these measures. And so then our focus usually is on, can we create a fund that can be more targeted to the people who are actually in need. In principle, for example, if there are those who are in need in informal settlements, like Ibera, Madare, then this fund is targeted towards them to ensure that they are well cushioned, that they are okay. There are those who are in small businesses. This fund is targeted towards those who are in small businesses, as opposed to then now the big businesses, the corporates. I think that approach would have been much better, and I think that is why they vacated it, but they did not give an alternative. That is the only challenge. In terms of opening up the economy, you see, the reason why I find that conversation a bit difficult to have, yes, is because in principle, we believe the economy is open. There is business that is happening, there is trade that is happening, there is production that is happening. It is not at capacity in terms of where we were or where we want to be, but there is economic activity that's going on. And so then the conversation of opening up the economy is usually, in fact, targeted at the curfew hours.
Of course. That's where the problem is.
That's where the problem is, because you see, people want to travel at night, one, or people want to just go out for entertainment. That population is very small compared to the population that is already in active productivity. And so then, for me, the priority would be, is there a way then that we can facilitate these people to do business without necessarily talking about just throwing caution to the wind?
Yeah. I want us to take a quick break. When we get back, we'll be getting the final remarks and perhaps a call or two from some of our viewers here as we seek a way forward. How do we move this conversation forward? You're watching The Front Row. Remember, on our social media platforms at Akisa Wandera, at KTN News KE, the hashtag to use is FRONTROW. And of course, our text line is open 22155. Let's take a look at some of your final thoughts before we close it at the top of the hour.